My name is Vesper Adair. I'm 34 years old, a forensic accountant, and for 12 years I've been the invisible pillar holding up a family that only remembers I exist when the bills are due. My mother once slapped me on her birthday and spat, "Don't bring that filthy look in here," before dragging me outside by my hair in front of Greenwich's finest. She didn't know my lawyer was sitting at table 3, documenting every second of her entitlement. But that was the end. To understand how a judge came to seize every asset she owned by the next afternoon, you have to understand the night the silence finally broke. The sound is what stays with you. Not the crash itself, but the rhythmic, surgical beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor in the dark. It's 1:42 a.m. on a Tuesday night. I'm lying in a narrow bed at Hartford Hospital, and the air smells of industrial-grade bleach and the kind of stale coffee that only exists in emergency rooms. My left arm is encased in a heavy, cold plaster cast that feels like an anchor. There's a sharp, persistent itch under the white gauze wrapped around my forehead, and a dull, throbbing pressure behind my eyes. A souvenir from the 3-car pileup on I-84. I wasn't on that highway for myself. I was driving back from a boutique in New York City with a garment bag hanging in the back seat. It contained a silk gown, hand-stitched, ivory, and costing more than most people's annual mortgage. My mother, Garnet, needed it in Hartford before sunrise for her 55th birthday gala. She had called me 3 times during my shift at the firm, her voice vibrating with that familiar, polished urgency. She didn't ask if I was tired. She didn't ask about my audit deadline. She simply said the Adair image depended on that dress, and since I was the reliable one, it was my responsibility to ensure it arrived. I remember the rain-slicked asphalt, the sudden blinding glare of high beams from a hydroplaning semi-truck, and the sickening sound of the metal folding like paper. Then, the silence. Now, in the ER, a nurse with tired eyes and a name tag that reads Sarah stands over me. She tells me I'm stable, but I have a concussion and a fractured radius. I need someone to sign the discharge papers and drive me home. I look at my phone. The screen is cracked. A spiderweb of glass over a photo of my father, Silas, the only person who ever saw me as a partner instead of a tool. He's been gone for 5 years, and his absence has never felt heavier than it does under these fluorescent lights. I know the family hierarchy. I know that my sister Callista is currently at a pre-party at a rooftop bar, and my mother is likely deep in a rehearsal with the string quartet. Still, I send a photo of my bandaged head to the family group chat. I was in an accident on I-84. I'm at the Hartford ER. I'm okay, but I need someone to sign me out and drive me back. The SUV is totaled. I watch the 3 little dots appear. Seen by Callista. Seen by Garnet. The first response is an emoji from Callista. A champagne glass. No words. Just a celebration I wasn't invited to. Then comes the message from my mother. I can almost hear her voice, the tone she uses when a servant breaks a piece of fine china. Vesper, do you have any idea how much that silk gown cost? It's a limited edition. If you got a single drop of blood on it, you won't be able to repay me in this lifetime. I just checked the business portal. I had to cancel your premium insurance rider last week to cover the deposit for the floral arrangements. It's for the Adair image. Surely you can pay the ER copay yourself. Call an Uber like an adult. We have a gala to prepare for. Don't be dramatic. I stare at the screen. The word dramatic sits there, mocking the IV drip in my arm. I realize then that I am not a daughter to them. I am a line item. I am a budget sacrifice made to afford better flowers. Nurse Sarah is standing close enough to see the text. She doesn't look away. She doesn't offer a platitude. She simply places a hand on my uninjured shoulder, her grip firm and grounded. I've seen a lot of things in this ER, honey, she whispers, her voice thick with a pity that feels like a burn. But that is a first. You aren't crazy. This isn't right. I don't cry. I've learned that tears are just another form of drama for people like Garnet. Instead, I feel a cold, crystalline stillness settle over me. It's the same feeling I get when I find a hidden discrepancy in a multi-million-dollar ledger. I'm not calling an Uber, I tell the nurse. My voice is quiet, but it doesn't shake. I reach into my bag and pull out a business card I've kept tucked in the back of my wallet for 3 years. It belongs to Hollis Thorne. He was my father's closest friend and a man who understands that in the state of Connecticut, blood and family are often very different things. I call him. He answers on the second ring. I explain the situation in 3 sentences. I don't ask for sympathy. I ask for a ride. While I wait, I don't rest. I open my work laptop with my one good hand. I begin a forensic audit of my own life. I start with the insurance cancellation Garnet mentioned. I pull up the Adair Trust documents. I block the group chat notifications. Every ping I ignore feels like a brick being removed from a wall that has been suffocating me for a decade. I realize that I haven't been forgotten. I've been erased. And you cannot erase someone who holds the keys to the vault. 20 minutes later, there is a soft but firm knock on the ER curtain. It isn't my mother coming to check on her filthy daughter. It is Hollis Thorne. He's wearing a charcoal overcoat, his silver hair neatly combed even at this hour. He's holding a leather binder that looks less like an office accessory and more like a weapon. He looks at my bandages, then at the yellowing bruise already forming on my cheek. He doesn't ask if I'm okay. He knows the answer. "Is it time, Vesper?" he asks, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Are we finally doing this?" I reach out my uninjured hand and touch the cold, textured cover of the binder. It's full of the truths I've been too loyal to speak. I think of the silk gown, the champagne emoji, and the 1:42 a.m. silence. "Yes," I say. "Let's bring the house down." Now let me take you back to the fall of 2018 in West Hartford, Connecticut. It was a season of long shadows and even longer silences on the Adair family estate. In that area, wealth wasn't just a number. It was an atmosphere. It smelled faintly of expensive beeswax on antique mahogany furniture and the damp, cool scent of stone wafting from the garden. The house was a sprawling Georgian colonial mansion, a monument to a family that valued preservation above all else. The I-84 crash wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable end of a system that had suffocated my life since I was old enough to read a balance sheet. In our house, love was a ledger that never quite balanced. It was a commodity, earned through meticulous obedience and ranked by how much prestige you could contribute to the family name. My father, Silas, was a man of quiet gravity who built the Adair wealth through grit and foresight. My mother, Garnet, was the one who curated the image of it. And then there was my sister, Callista. The contrast between us was established early, like 2 different species kept in the same terrarium. Callista was ethereal and Instagram perfect. She was a porcelain doll designed for the parlor, fragile and perpetually in need of protection. I was utilitarian. I was the engine hidden behind the basement door, sturdy and reliable, the one who kept the lights on so the art could be admired. My sister was celebrated for simply existing. I was managed for being useful. I remember a specific Tuesday evening in October. I had spent 72 hours straight in the mahogany-lined home library. I was 26 then, fresh out of my master's program, and Garnet's financial advisor, a socialite friend with more charm than math skills, had left the family's quarterly tax filings in a catastrophic state of neglect. If left uncorrected, the IRS would have frozen the family's liquid assets within the month. I didn't sleep. I drank cold espresso that tasted like copper and lived off the sheer adrenaline of numbers. By 4 a.m., I had untangled the mess, saving the family roughly $1.2 million in potential penalties and interest. When the sun finally hit the velvet curtains, Garnet drifted in. She was wearing a silk robe that cost more than my car. She didn't look at the stacks of corrected forms or the spreadsheet on my laptop that represented a small fortune saved. Instead, her eyes locked onto a tiny, quarter-inch ring of dried coffee on a $40,000 Persian rug near my chair. Vesper. Her voice was a soft, sharp blade. A master's degree in forensic accounting doesn't make you any less of a servant if you can't even respect the furniture. Clean this up immediately. Your sister is coming down for breakfast and I won't have her seeing this filth. I didn't argue. I didn't point out that the rug was still there because I had saved the money to pay for its insurance. I simply got on my knees with a damp cloth and scrubbed the fibers until my knuckles were raw. I swallowed the pride because, in my mind, I was the guardian of my father's legacy. I convinced myself that Garnet and Callista were just the beneficiaries of a system I was built to protect. It was a form of self-preservation. If I could rationalize the insult, I could survive the environment. The pattern repeated itself like a recursive loop. Later that same week, Garnet hosted a dinner party for the Hartford elite. I sat at the far end of the table, invisible in a plain navy blazer, while Garnet spent 20 minutes bragging to a group of bankers about Callista's artistic vision. Callista had apparently curated a Pinterest board for a boutique she wanted to open, a boutique that Vesper's labor would inevitably have to fund. Callista basked in the glow of the candles, smiling like a saint, while my mother spoke as if I weren't even in the room. Callista has such a delicate soul, Garnet told the table. She needs a world that is beautiful. Vesper, on the other hand, prefers the grittiness of numbers. Someone has to be the realist, I suppose. I looked at the guests. I saw them nodding, accepting the narrative. I saw the way my mother looked through me, as if I were a piece of essential but unsightly drywall. I told myself it made sense. Callista needed the validation because she had no skills. I didn't need it because I had the work. I could handle the coldness because I was the strong one. But as the winter of 2018 approached, the engine began to hear a rattling in the gears. One night, while doing a routine sweep of the Adair trust accounts, I noticed a series of wire transfers, six-figure sums moving into an offshore entity in the Cayman Islands. It wasn't my father's signature. It was a digital authorization from my mother's portal, one I had set up for her for emergencies only. I realized then that the favoritism wasn't just emotional. It wasn't just Garnet's preference for a prettier, softer daughter. It was tactical. The scapegoat isn't just the one who takes the blame. She's the one who carries the debt. I was wrong to think I was just the engine. I was the bank. And looking at those offshore numbers, I realized the bank was being robbed from the inside. I was about to pay a price I hadn't agreed to, and for the first time, the mahogany walls of the Adair mansion felt less like a fortress and more like a cage. There was a period in the spring of 2021 when the house in West Hartford felt warm. It was what I now call the temperature swing, that deceptive moment when a predator stops growling and starts purring to make the prey forget the cage. Garnet started bringing me espresso in the library while I worked. She'd linger by the mahogany desk, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder, asking about the intricate details of my forensic audit projects. She remembered every name of my colleagues, the specific encryption levels of my work files, and the exact dates of my quarterly travel. At the time, I was hungry, starving really, for that version of a mother. I thought she was finally seeing me, finally respecting the mind that kept the Adair estate from drowning. I told her everything. I shared the success of my recent contracts and the complexities of my security protocols. I fed her the very data she would later use to trap me. It felt like connection, like a bridge being built over years of cold indifference. In reality, it was a deposition. I didn't realize that in my family, interest isn't an expression of love, it's reconnaissance. That April, while I was clearing out my father Silas's old desk to make room for Callista's latest creative mood boards, I found a heavy brass key taped securely under the lining of the bottom drawer. A small, handwritten tag was attached to it in Silas's precise architectural script: safety deposit box, 804, Capital Hartford Bank, for Vesper, when the air runs out. I didn't tell Garnet. I didn't tell Callista. I tucked it into my bra and later moved it to a secure location. It was the only solid thing in a house built on illusions. The first ask happened 2 weeks later. Garnet walked into my office looking uncharacteristically fragile. She mentioned a temporary liquidity issue with Callista's new boutique venture. "Just this once, Vesper," she whispered, her eyes brimming with a practiced moisture. "Only for a month until the insurance payout for the winter storm damage clears. It would save your sister so much embarrassment." I transferred the $15,000. My hand trembled slightly as I hit send on the wire transfer, but I felt a strange, intoxicating rush of value. For the first time, I wasn't just the utilitarian daughter. I was the savior. It was the beginning of my ATM training. The one-time loan quickly dissolved into a monthly maintenance fee for Callista's lifestyle. It became $4,000 for her rent, $20,000 for Garnet's charity gala deposits, and a revolving door of emergencies. roof repairs that were never scheduled, and private club fees that were never questioned. I was no longer a daughter. I was a recurring transaction. The pivot toward the truly dark happened in August. I received a notification on my phone, a credit inquiry from a high-interest lender I had never contacted. When I dug into the digital paper trail, the floor seemed to drop out from beneath the library. Callista, with Garnet's explicit blessing and access to my personal files, had used my social security number to secure a $500,000 bridge loan for a fashion line that was already hemorrhaging money. When I confronted them in the dining room, Garnet didn't offer an apology. She didn't even offer a defense. She used the compliment with poison. "Vesper, you have the best FICO score in this family," she said, sipping her wine as if we were discussing the weather. "It's the only way to save the Adair name from a public lien. Your father would have wanted you to vac, to carry this weight for your sister. Don't be selfish over mere numbers. You have the intellect to earn it back. Callista only has her reputation." The word selfish hit me like a physical blow. To be called selfish by the people currently picking your pockets is a specific kind of psychological torture. I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I went back to my office and created a hidden, double-encrypted file on my laptop. I named it Project Ghost. I began to archive everything. Every wire transfer, every emergency text message, every forged signature on every loan application. I became a forensic accountant for my own betrayal. I realized that a person who is tolerated but not loved is often kept around solely because they are profitable. As someone once said, those who do not move do not notice their chains. I was moving now. I sat in the dark that night, staring at the shock number at the bottom of my spreadsheet. Over 3 years, I had poured $342,800 of my personal earnings and the small inheritance Silas had left me into a black hole of Adair vanity. Column A, date. Column B, quantity. Column C, reason. Column D, lie. I stared at the total until my eyes burned. I hadn't just given them money. I had given them the ammunition. I had handed them the keys to my own cage and thanked them for the privilege of staying inside. I told myself I could manage it. I told myself I was strong enough to keep the Adair ship afloat, never realizing that Garnet was already planning to scuttle the ship with me still locked in the engine room. I was so focused on the numbers that I didn't see the truck coming on I-84. And I didn't realize that in my family, a car wreck wasn't a tragedy. It was just another way to get a payout. The reckoning was coming, and I was the only one who knew the true cost of the bill. October 14th, 11:22 p.m. That was the point where the world stopped being about spreadsheets and started being about survival. I was driving eastbound on I-84, the steering wheel of the family's heavy SUV slick beneath my palms. The rain wasn't just falling. It was a rhythmic assault against the glass, blurring the world into streaks of gray and neon. In the back sat the ivory silk gown and 3 crates of hand-blown crystal centerpieces for the gala. I was doing exactly what I had been trained to do for 12 years, carrying the weight so they could enjoy the light. Then, the mechanism of the world failed. A semi-truck hydroplaned 3 lanes over. I remember the scream of twisting metal, a sound so industrial and final it felt like the sky was tearing. The impact followed, a violent, bone-shaking jolt. The smell of gunpowder from the airbag deployment filled the cabin, sharp and acrid. I tasted copper as my lips split against the wheel. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of the rain hitting the mangled hood and the distant, lonely wail of a car alarm. When I drifted back into consciousness, the gray rain had been replaced by the sterile, blue-white glare of the Hartford ER. Everything felt underwater. The rhythmic tink-tink of the IV pole was the only thing keeping time. A police officer stood at the foot of my bed, his badge glinting under the harsh lights. He was holding a clipboard. Police report #7784 CT. Case #204A. He spoke about unavoidable circumstances and miraculous survival, but his voice was just a dull hum in the back of my skull. By 1:15 a.m., the adrenaline had ebbed away, leaving only the cold reality of the paperwork. The attending physician told me I was stable, but the hospital was at capacity. I had a deadline. I needed to be discharged by 2 a.m. to make room for incoming trauma cases, or I would be moved to a mandatory holding ward for the night. I needed a signature and a ride home. Just 20 minutes. That was all it would take to end this nightmare. I picked up my phone. The screen was shattered, but the touch interface still flickered to life. I opened the family thread. Accident on I-84, in the ER. Stable, but I need a ride home. Discharge is at 2 a.m. Can someone come? I can't drive. I watched the scene icons appear. The silence of the room was deafening as I waited for the ping. 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5, then Garnet's name appeared. Vesper, we're in the middle of the final quartet rehearsal. The acoustics in the ballroom are already a nightmare. I just checked the business portal. I had to cancel your premium insurance rider last week to cover the deposit for the floral arrangements. It's for the Adair image. Surely you can pay the ER co-pay yourself. Call a car. Don't be a burden tonight. We have 300 guests arriving in 36 hours. Beneath her paragraph, a single reaction appeared from Callista's number. The laughter of a sister on a screen while I sat on a thin mattress with blood drying in my hair. I stared at the message until the words blurred. I didn't feel rage. I felt a profound, freezing clarity. I had been an asset to them, a reliable piece of machinery. But now that the machine was dented, the cost of repair was more than they were willing to pay. I wasn't being supported. I was being appraised. Nurse Sarah, who had been adjusting my vitals monitor, stopped. She hadn't meant to look, but the glow of the screen was bright in the dim bay. She saw the text. She saw the emoji. Her jaw tightened, a small human movement that was the first bit of warmth I'd felt all night. She didn't offer a hollow apology. She simply reached for her own tablet, her pen scratching against the digital intake form. I'm noting the lack of family support in the discharge log, Vesper, she said quietly. I saw it. I'm documenting the refusal of transport. You aren't imagining this. This isn't right. That was the official anchor. Discharge paperwork #882B. Noted. Patient requested family assistance. Request denied via digital communication at 1:28 a.m. I didn't argue with the void. I didn't send a follow-up text. I simply asked Sarah for my laptop bag. My fingers were stiff and bruised, but they still knew how to navigate a ledger. I called Hollis Thorne. Then, I opened my banking app. I didn't wait for a miracle. I hired a private medical transport car, an emergency night rate of $450. It was an exorbitant price for a 4-mile trip, but as I authorized the payment, I realized it was worth every penny. It was the price of my own autonomy. It was the moment I stopped being an Adair ward and started being an independent agent. The aftermath was a blur of 3 days. I spent them in a quiet, anonymous motel room near the park, away from the beeswax and mahogany of the mansion. My body ached, a deep, muscular throb that made every movement a deliberate choice. I looked at the discharge papers, the police report, and the bill estimate from the hospital. These weren't just papers. They were the blueprints of a new life. On the third morning, as I sat on the edge of the motel bed with my discharge papers in hand, I looked at the truth for what it was. I sat in the back of a black car driven by a stranger named Marcus on the night of the crash. He had offered me a bottle of water and adjusted the heat without me asking. He had driven slowly, avoiding the bumps, because he saw the bandage on my head. Strangers took better care of my situation in 10 minutes than my own family had in 30 years. The woman who would do anything to protect the Adair image had stayed in that wreckage on I-84. The woman who walked out of that hospital was someone else. The old road was closed. I didn't need to block their numbers yet. I just needed to stop answering the call of a ghost. Recovery doesn't happen in a single heroic moment. It happens in the mundane stillness of a beige room. I spent the next 48 hours in a temporary corporate apartment in Hartford. The space was anonymous and functional. Neutral walls, industrial carpeting, and a window that overlooked a quiet side street. The air smelled of the faint, medicinal scent of arnica cream I used for my shoulder and the lukewarm, burnt coffee from the pod machine in the kitchenette. I sat in front of the vanity mirror, looking at the bruise on my cheek. It had transitioned from a deep purple to a sickly, mustard yellow. I touched the white medical tape on my arm, feeling the dull ache of the fracture underneath. But as the swelling went down, the clarity went up. I looked at my reflection and realized I was no longer seeing Allison Adair, the version of myself they had spent 30 years cultivating, the one who apologized for her own competence. I was seeing Vesper. The choice was binary. It was the simplest math I had ever done. Keep paying for the privilege of being hated, or stop the bleeding. Break, or build. I chose to build. I opened my laptop. The screen's cold blue glow was the only light in the dim room. I navigated to the encrypted file I had labeled Project Ghost. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reconciliation. In forensic accounting, when a system is hemorrhaging assets, the first step is always the same. You isolate the leak. I opened my banking portal and stared at the list of recurring transfers. They looked like digital scars on the screen. Automatic payments that had become so normalized I barely noticed them anymore. I saw the $4,200 monthly mortgage payment for Callista's West Hartford boutique. I saw the secondary credit card authorizations for C. Adair. I saw the direct debits for Garnet's country club membership. I felt no anger as I began the process. I felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of an architect dismantling a condemned structure. Click. I canceled the recurring mortgage payment for the boutique. Click. I rescinded authorization for all secondary credit cards issued under my primary account. Click. I flagged the $500,000 bridge loan as fraudulent and initiated a Social Security alert for unauthorized identity use. Click. I moved my multi-factor authentication and two-step verification to a secure encrypted line managed through Hollis Thorne's office. Finally, I navigated to the Adair Legacy group chat. I didn't type a manifesto. I didn't send a parting shot. I simply muted the notifications and archived the history. There was no dramatic music, no shouting match, just the soft, mechanical click of a mouse and the hum of the cooling fan. It felt like setting down a mountain I had never been meant to carry. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was healing. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness. It was Hollis. He walked in carrying a deli sandwich wrapped in white paper and a thick manila folder. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knew the Adair version of okay was a lie. He sat the sandwich on the small desk and looked at my laptop screen. "You did it?" he asked. "The accounts are isolated," I replied. "The bleeding has stopped." Hollis sat down, his expression hardening. He opened the folder. "Garnet isn't sitting still, Vesper. She hasn't called the hospital to check on your discharge, but she has called her legal team. My contact at the probate court says she's filing an emergency guardianship petition tomorrow morning." I paused, my hand hovering over the sandwich. "On what grounds?" "Incapacity," Hollis said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "She's citing the I-84 accident. She's claiming you have cognitive impairment from the concussion and that your recent erratic behavior, meaning you stopped answering her calls, is proof you can no longer manage your own affairs or the Adair Trust. She wants to legally seize control of your identity before the gala." The silent predator move. It was a classic play in the Adair handbook. If you can't control the person, you invalidate the mind. I took a bite of the sandwich. I wasn't afraid. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of gratitude for her entitlement. "She thinks I'm broken," I said quietly. "That's her biggest mistake. She's fighting a daughter she thinks she owns. I'm fighting a forensic auditor who has every receipt." Hollis leaned forward. "We could block the petition now. We have the hospital records." "No," I said. "Let her file it. If we fight now, she'll go into damage control and hide the offshore transfers. I want her to feel confident. I want her to stand in front of everyone she respects and tell the lie. I want her to commit herself to a narrative that I can disprove in public." I knew the fallout was coming. Garnet's birthday gala was in 3 days. She expected a celebration of her own perfection, paid for by the daughter she called filthy. She would notice the money was gone long before she noticed my absence. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted, a night everyone in Hartford would remember. I thought the silence of the last few days would be the hardest part of this journey. But as I looked at the guardianship papers Garnet was preparing, I realized I hadn't even seen the depths of how far she would go to keep her secrets hidden. I was no longer waiting for her to love me. I was just waiting for the clock to strike 7. My new life in downtown Hartford existed within a 400-square-foot radius of absolute, intentional silence. My studio apartment was a sanctuary of anonymity. It smelled of fresh linen, unscented soy candles, and the absence of mahogany. There was no beeswax here, no oil portraits of ancestors watching my every move to ensure I didn't smudge the prestige. I had established a new routine: coffee at 6 a.m., an hour of painful physical therapy for my fractured radius, and the luxury of a phone that no longer vibrated with emergencies that were actually just errands for my sister. Vesper Adair. That was the name on the new lease. That was the name I whispered to myself when the painkillers made the world feel blurry. But the apartment was quiet while my body remained loud. My left arm throbbed whenever the barometric pressure shifted, and I still found myself staring at the 2 empty chairs at my small dining table for 5 seconds too long, as if waiting for a demand to be issued. I spent my evenings staring at the Project Ghost file on my laptop, the digital ledger of my erasure. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been systematically processed into a non-entity. The calm before the storm ended on Friday evening at 7:12 p.m. There were 3 sharp, mechanical knocks on my door. They didn't have the rhythm of a friend or the hesitation of a neighbor. I looked through the peephole and saw a man in a navy windbreaker holding a thick manila envelope. When I opened the door, he didn't offer a greeting. "Vesper Adair?" he asked, checking a photo on his phone. "I am. You've been served." He handed me the envelope and was down the hallway before I could reach for a pen. I sat on my sofa, my fingers trembling slightly as I broke the seal. This was proof object #4, the escalation I had anticipated but hadn't quite felt until the weight of the paper was in my hand. It was a formal summons from Garnet's new legal counsel, but it was wrapped in a sharper blade. It wasn't just the emergency guardianship petition Hollis had warned me about. It was an ultimatum. The document stated that if I did not appear at the Glass House Gala at 8 p.m. tomorrow to hand over the master encryption keys to the Adair Trust, Garnet would proceed with an emergency injunction to auction Silas Adair's private library. My father's life's work, his rare first editions, his architectural blueprints, his journals, were being held hostage to satisfy outstanding debts incurred by my supposed incapacity. I sat in the dark for exactly 12 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't call Garnet to beg. I realized that my mother wasn't just trying to take my money. She was trying to burn the only man who had ever loved me to get to it. Hollis Thorne arrived at 7:40 p.m. He looked at the summons and then at me. He didn't offer a platitude. "At that event, Vesper, facts will speak," he said, his voice a steady, low-frequency hum. "But you need to decide how you want to be heard. You can go as the daughter they want to see, or you can go as the truth." "I'm going as the truth," I said. At 7:52 p.m. On the night of the gala, I stood before the mirror. I chose a simple, dark navy dress that cost 1/20th of Garnet's Valentino. I refused to use concealer on the mustard-yellow bruise that still marked my left cheekbone. I kept the white surgical bandage on my arm, stark and clinical against the dark fabric. I wasn't going as a guest. I was going as the crime scene. "You look like Vesper Adair," Hollis said as he handed me the heavy leather binder. It was the audit of 12 years of silence. I checked the digital invitation Garnet had sent to my archived email address as a final mocking gesture. I scrolled to the guest list. There, among the judges, the philanthropists, and the old money dynasties of Connecticut, was my name. It didn't say Vesper Adair, forensic accountant. It was listed as Allison Adair, ward, dependent. The erasure was complete. My mother had already told the world I was a broken thing before I had even stepped into the room. I looked at the clock. ETA to the Glass House was 15 minutes. I spent 4 minutes pinning my hair back, exposing the bandage on my head. Then I picked up the binder. Hollis and I shared a measured 5 seconds of silence. No words were needed. I had spent my entire life being the engine that kept the Adair family moving. Tonight, I was going to be the wall they crashed into. "Let's go," I said. Preparation for a forensic audit is a silent, rhythmic war. At 5 p.m., the only sound in my temporary apartment was the steady, industrious hum of a high-speed laser printer. I stood by the desk, the air smelling of hot toner and ozone. as sheet after sheet of high bond paper slid into the tray. With my bruised fingers, I organized 3 years of credit card statements, wire transfer receipts, and the forged bridge loan application into transparent plastic sleeves. I snapped, the rings of a heavy black leather binder shut. It sounded like the bolt of a rifle being slid into place. This was my weapon, though it carried no gunpowder, only the cold, indisputable weight of the truth. I had labeled the tabs with surgical precision. Tab 1, Callista's boutique defaults. Tab 2, the $500,000 fraudulent loan. Tab 3, the hospital insurance cancellation log. Hollis Thorne leaned against the doorframe, checking his watch. He walked over and flipped through the final pages, his eyes stopping on the bottom line of the summary sheet. $360,000, Hollis said, his voice quiet. And they spent a decade calling you a burden. You aren't bringing a gift to this party, Vesper. You're bringing a mirror. Let the paper do the talking. I checked the clasp on the binder one last time. My reflection in the black leather was pale, the yellow bruise on my cheekbones stark against my skin. I'm not here to win, Hollis. I'm here to stop being a ghost in my own life. Integrity is the only thing you can't buy with someone else's money. As we prepared to leave, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from a cousin I hadn't seen in years. Garnet's been making calls all afternoon. She told everyone at the country club that you had a total mental break after the I-84 crash. She says you're erratic and sensitive. Watch your back, Vesper. The smear campaign had arrived before I had. It was a classic move to discredit the witness before she could take the stand. I didn't reply. I simply tucked the phone away and picked up my binder. The Glass House restaurant was a temple of glass and steel overlooking the Connecticut River, a place where Hartford's old money dynasties went to confirm their own importance. As I stepped through the heavy doors, the sound of a string quartet playing Vivaldi mingled with the expensive clink of champagne glasses. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and French perfume. I was the only dark spot in a room of sequins and silk. In my simple navy dress, with the surgical bandage still wrapped around my arm and the bruise on my face, I felt the room go cold. Conversations didn't stop. They just lowered into sharp, jagged whispers. I felt the weight of 30 pairs of eyes, that particular Hartford pity that is indistinguishable from suspicion. I didn't look down. I carried the binder like a shield and walked toward the center of the arena. Garnet Adair glided toward me, looking like a true queen of high society. The queen of high society. She wore the Valentino silk dress that I had nearly died delivering. She smiled, a fake smile, but her eyes were searching my face for traces of the broken girl she had described to her clients. "Vesper, dear," she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby table of philanthropists to hear. "You look exhausted. Are you sure you're feeling better? We were all so worried about your recent confusion." I stood my ground, my spine a straight line of cold steel. "I'm quite clear, Mrs. Adair. Thank you for your concern." The use of Mrs. Adair instead of mother sent a visible ripple through the group. Garnet's smile didn't slip, but her jaw tightened. She turned to the circle of guests, her hand resting on a congressman's shoulder. "Poor Vesper," she sighed, a sound like a silk scarf catching on a thorn. "Since the accident, she's been having these dramatic breakdowns. It's been a heavy cross for the family to carry, but we stay strong, don't we?" The crowd nodded, accepting the narrative. I said nothing. I didn't argue. I just walked toward table 3. The moment of the birthday slap happened at 8:42 p.m. Garnet was standing near the head table, accepting a toast from the bank board members. I walked up to her, not with a glass, but with the leather binder. "The forensic audit for Callista's boutique is finished, Garnet," I said, my voice steady and audible. "Since you're discussing the family's legacy tonight, I think the partners should see the actual numbers behind the Adair Trust." Garnet didn't take the binder. The mask of the polished mother didn't just slip, it disintegrated. She snapped. A sharp, flat crack echoed through the glass-walled room as her palm hit my bruised cheek. The force of it reopened the cut from the steering wheel. "Don't you dare bring that filthy look and those lies into my night," she spat. Her face was contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement. At that moment, her reason had completely vanished. She grabbed my hair, her knuckles turning white, and began dragging me 3 steps toward the exit in a blind, frenzied rage. "Get out of here and clean up my mess!" she screamed. "Get out and clean up my mess!" The quartet stopped. A champagne flute shattered on the floor. At table 3, Hollis Thorne stood up. He didn't shout. He simply held up his smartphone, the small red light indicating he was live streaming the entire scene to the probate court's secure evidence server. He made steady eye contact with Judge Althea Greer, who was seated just 2 tables away, her face a mask of cold judicial appraisal. Garnet realized she had made a fatal error. In a desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative, she rushed to the podium, grabbing the microphone from the host. "Before anyone says anything, the family should know about Vesper's tragic condition," she started, her voice high and trembling. "She's not herself." I stood by the door, my hair disheveled, a trickle of blood running down my jaw from the reopened wound. I looked at Hollis, then back at the woman on the stage. "My father was right about you, Garnet," I whispered to the silent room. "The transaction is over." Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sounds like the dry scratch of a fountain pen across high bond paper at 2:15 a.m. While the elite of Hartford were still scrubbing the silk of their gala gowns, Judge Althea Greer was in her private study, reviewing the digital evidence server. She watched the live-streamed video of my mother grabbing my hair and dragging me through a restaurant foyer. She reviewed the morality clause my father Silas had embedded into the Adair Trust a decade ago, a clause that stipulated the immediate suspension of any trustee who engaged in acts of moral turpitude or physical endangerment against a beneficiary. The ink from her signature was permanent before the sun even hit the Connecticut River. By 8:30 a.m., the atmosphere at the Glass House breakfast room was one of polished, performative denial. Garnet and Callista were seated at a prime corner table, surrounded by a few remaining members of their social circle. They were laughing, sipping mimosas, and discussing the unfortunate drama of the night before, as if it were a minor wine stain on an expensive linen tablecloth. Garnet was telling Mrs. Sterling that my concussion-induced episode had been handled with maternal grace. I was seated at a small, isolated side table 10 feet away. I was barely a person to them, just a shadow with a surgical bandage on my arm and a yellowing bruise that marked the site of the slap. I sipped my chamomile tea in total, clinical silence. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. In forensic accounting, you learn that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the emptiest accounts. The collapse began with a bill. The waiter approached Garnet's table with the weekend's total, $15,340.22. Garnet didn't even look at the number. She reached into her clutch, produced her black titanium card, and handed it to the waiter with a dismissive flick of her wrist. 2 minutes of agonizing silence followed. The quartet wasn't playing this morning. The only sound was the hum of the HVAC system and the distant clink of silverware. The waiter returned, his face pale, leaning in close. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Adair," he whispered. "The transaction was declined." Garnet scoffed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Try it again. Your machine is clearly malfunctioning." He tried. He tried a second card, then a third. Declined. Declined. Restricted. Hollis Thorne walked into the room at that exact moment. He wasn't wearing his overcoat. He was in a sharp gray suit carrying a single sheet of paper. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked to Garnet's table and placed the paper on the white linen. It was a ledger of the previous 12 hours. "The Adair Trust accounts have been frozen by court order as of 2:15 this morning," Hollis said. He looked at the surrounding philanthropists, then back to Garnet. "The forensic audit is complete. October 14th, 2023, $20,000 for charity, transferred directly to Callista's boutique rent. March 12th, 2024, $500,000 bridge loan using Vesper's social security number without authorization. Total unmanaged diversion, $842,800. He then read aloud a printed email from Garnet to the bank manager. "Vesper is currently erratic and mentally unstable. Ignore any attempts she makes to flag the boutique transfers. She is confused. The silence that followed was atmospheric. Mrs. Sterling and the other friends at the table didn't gasp. They did something much more devastating. They simply moved. They slid their chairs back. They adjusted their coats. They became intensely interested in their phones. In Greenwich, social death isn't a scream. It's the sound of people physically creating distance between themselves and a liability. At the entrance, 2 sheriff's deputies in plain clothes appeared. They weren't there to make a scene or an arrest. They were there to fulfill the court's directive. "Mrs. Adair," a man said calmly, "we're here to escort you to the West Hartford estate. The court has issued an emergency property foreclosure order. We need to begin cataloging and red taping, the administrative procedure, on the properties within the estate." Garnet looked at me then. Her face was a mask of mottled gray, her eyes wide with a fear she had never permitted herself to feel. She opened her mouth to speak, to launch into a high-pitched, desperate explanation about how I had destroyed the family. I stood up. I spoke for the first and only time. "I didn't come here to humiliate you, Garnet. I came here to stop the bleeding. For 12 years, I was the machine you used until it burned out, and then you slapped it because it smoked. I've fulfilled all my obligations to Silas Adair. I owe nothing to the woman who hit me on her birthday while I was still bleeding from an accident I caused her. This is the end of the deal. That's the line." I set my teacup down on the saucer. It made a soft, final clink that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. I didn't wait for her answer. I didn't turn around as the officers began leading her out the door. I grabbed my black briefcase, my fingers feeling firm and warm after weeks. I stepped out the window and breathed in the cool, fresh Connecticut air. Adair's name remains on the building, but its weight has vanished. The axis of the world has shifted, and I hold the compass. The aftermath of a public collapse doesn't sound like a storm. It sounds like a vacuum. After I walked away from the breakfast table at the glass house, the string quartet didn't resume. The only sound was the hollow hum of the air conditioning and the faint, lonely clink of a waiter clearing a single abandoned mimosa glass. As I walked toward the exit, I watched the friends of the Adair family, the judges, the donors, the dynasty builders, silently adjust their coats and turn their shoulders. They didn't offer Garnet comfort. In our world, an asset seizure is more than a financial failure. It's a contagious disease. The Adair name hadn't just lost its money, it had lost its gravity. I passed Callista in the foyer. She was staring at her phone in a catatonic silence, her Instagram-perfect life dissolving into a series of declined transactions. No one asked for her opinion. No one shouted. The order of the world had simply changed. The weeks that followed were a montage of cold, procedural finality. I watched from a distance as the West Hartford mansion, the Georgian monument to my erasure, was draped in red, seized tape. Callista moved into a cramped studio apartment she couldn't afford, while Garnet's calls began to flood my voicemail. She didn't ask how I was. She told me I had humiliated the bloodline, and asked how I could be so cruel after all she had given me. I didn't delete the messages, but I didn't listen to them either. I didn't need to. I had already finished the audit. The final piece of the puzzle arrived when Hollis Thorne and I finally opened safety deposit box 804 at Capital Hartford Bank. Inside there was no gold, no jewelry. There was a single waterproof ledger and a flash drive. It was Silas Adair's final audit of his own marriage. He had documented Garnet's systematic embezzlement of the trust for over a decade and her attempts to poison his reputation before he died. He had known. He had left me the oxygen I needed to survive her. I handed the file to Hollis with a steady hand. "Let the law finish it," I said. I didn't stay for the investigation or the inevitable charges. I closed the book on Hartford. 6 months later, I am sitting in a small, sunny office in Boston. There's no mahogany here. The furniture is made of light pine, and the large windows show a sky that isn't filtered through the weight of a family's expectations. I sat at my laptop this morning and hovered the cursor over a file. Adair_estate_final_account.pdf. I hit delete. The world didn't end when I stopped carrying it. It just got quieter. I spent 30 years trying to be the daughter Garnet wanted, only to realize I didn't need her recognition to know my own name. I am Vesper. That is enough. If you are listening to this, and you are carrying a burden that was never yours to bear, if you are the pillar holding up a house that refuses to see you, you have my permission to set it down. The world will keep turning. I promise. The Adair mansion is gone. The filthy look is gone. But for the first time in my life, I am home.